Welcome everyone to this Policy Institute event where we'll be talking about Daniel Susskind's book, Future of Work, and all the issues, all the fascinating issues that raises. I'm Bobby Duffy. I'm director of the Policy Institute at King's College London, and it's a real pleasure to host this event today for all sorts of reasons, given the importance and relevance of the topic. It's also a brilliant way to welcome Daniel, who's a new visiting professor at the Policy Institute and the Department of Political Economy at King's. And he's joining Alec Ross, who will be chairing the event today, who's also a visiting professor at Policy Institute at King's. So we've got a great connection here. And then obviously we've got a brilliant commentator respondent from Liz, but I'm going to let Alec do a proper panel introduction and lay out the structure of the event. And I'm going to join the audience because I can't wait to watch this myself, having read the book and enjoyed it a great deal. So I'm just going to hand over to Alec, who can set you off on a brilliant discussion. Please enjoy, everyone.
All right, everyone. Look, it's terrific to be with you. Look, new technologies have always provoked panic about workers being replaced by machines. In the past, such fears have been misplaced, and many economists maintain that they remain so today. Yet in his recent book, A World Without Work, Technology, Automation, and How We Should Respond, Daniel Susskind, who we are very lucky to have with us today, shows why this time really is different, and that tasks that used to be beyond the capability of computers, from diagnosing illnesses to drafting legal contracts, are now within their reach. And so we've got a little less than an hour together today. And what we're hoping for is as interactive a session as possible. We're going to begin with some remarks from Daniel Susskind, which will then be followed by a response from Liz Reynolds. We're then going to have a brief discussion between the three of us and then open things up to your questions. But I wanted to do a bit of a proper introduction of both Daniel and Liz, given their remarkable backgrounds. Daniel Susskind explores the impact of technology, particularly AI, on work and society. He's a fellow in economics at Balliol College, Oxford, and as Bobby said, a visiting professor at King's College London. And at the core of this session is the future of professions and the future of work as described as in his incredibly important book, A World Without Work, which the New York Times described as required reading for any potential presidential candidate thinking about the economy of the future. I have the feeling I could guess which presidential candidates would have and would not have read that book. And we're also joined by Liz Reynolds, who's the principal research scientist and lecturer in MIT's Department of Urban Studies and Planning. She's the executive director of the MIT Industrial Performance Center and more recently executive director of MIT's Institute-wide Task Force on the Work of the Future. So my goodness, between Daniel Susskind and Liz Reynolds, there's a lot of intellectual horsepower on this panel today, keeping myself entirely out of that. And what I'd love to do now is get right into things and hand the word over to you, Daniel.
Well, thank you so much for that warm introduction. It really is a great pleasure to be with you all this afternoon to talk with you about the future of work. What I want to do in the next 10 minutes or so are two things. The first is I just want to share a few ideas from my new book, A World Without Work. And then I want to put those ideas in the context of the sort of remarkable pandemic that we currently find ourselves in and think about automation again through that lens. So let me begin with the book. I mean, every day we hear stories of systems and machines that are taking on tasks and activities we thought only human beings alone could ever do. Making medical diagnoses and driving cars, drafting legal contracts and designing buildings, composing music and writing news reports. What does all of this progress mean for the vast majority of us? Our job is our main, if not our only source of income. I wrote A World Without Work because I don't think we're taking seriously enough the threat of a world where there's not enough well-paid work for everyone to do, because of these technological changes that are taking place. Now, it's very important to say that anybody who picks up the book expecting some dramatic account of a sudden technological big bang, after which lots of people find themselves without work, they're going to be bitterly disappointed, because that isn't what I think is going to happen. Work is going to remain for some time to come. What I worry about is a more gradual and I think subtler problem, which is that as we move through the 21st century, more and more people might find themselves unable to make the sorts of economic contributions to society that they might have hoped or expected to make, say, in the 20th century, given the sort of education that they have, given the background that they're from, and so on. And so it's a less gradual and a less dramatic story, perhaps, but I don't think any less challenging a problem. And in my view, it will present us with three quite different challenges. And my book is about these challenges and how we ought to respond. So just very briefly, what are those challenges? Well, the first is an economic challenge. And it's fundamentally, in my mind, a distributional one. How do we share our income in society when our traditional way of doing so, paying people for the work that they do, might, for some people, be far less effective than it was in the past? The second, I think, actually has far less to do with economics, and it's what we do about the large technology companies, big tech, who are increasingly responsible for developing these technologies in the first place. Now, in my view, in the 20th century, our main preoccupation was with the economic power of large companies, their profitability and their pricing and their market concentration and so on. What I worry about far more in the 21st century is not their economic power, but their political power, their impact on things like liberty and democracy, social justice, and whether or not those things are under threat. And the final challenge actually also doesn't have a lot to do with economics at all. It's the challenge of finding meaning and purpose. It's often said that work isn't simply a source of an income, but it's also a source of direction and fulfillment in life. And if that's right, the challenge of technological change isn't just that it will hollow out the labor market, but that it might also hollow out the sense of meaning and purpose that some people get from their work. And so these are the challenges that I think will be presented with, and each of them demands a response. Now, I wrote this book and I published it in January of this year, 2 months after, of course, the pandemic really start to hit in my particular corner of the world. And what I found so striking about the pandemic was that it seemed to me the past 8 months have given us a glimpse of this quite troubling and challenging future. You know, we have found ourselves over the last few months in a world with less work, not because the robots took all the jobs, but because this virus just completely decimated the demand that so many of those jobs relied upon, and the interventions that we've had to adopt to try and contain its spread have necessarily made economic matters worse. So a set of challenges that I thought we'd face with growing severity in the coming decades, we've instead had to face right now because of this virus. I thought, Andrew Yang, the former US presidential candidate, put it quite well in a tweet at the start of the pandemic when he said, I should have been talking about a pandemic instead of automation. Because there is, I think, a sense in which the challenges that we face from automation are quite similar to the challenges we've had to face over the last few months. So let's just run through those challenges. First, the economic challenge. I mean, this is precisely the challenge that policymakers have had to grapple with. Overnight, large numbers of people woke up and found themselves without work. And so we had to figure out a distributional question. Well, how do we share our income in society when we can't rely upon the labor market to do it for everyone? Then there's the challenge of the large technology companies. I think it's a very conspicuous feature of the contemporary sort of pandemic landscape that a small number of large technology companies have done extremely well, whereas the large majority of small businesses that make up the backbone of our economic lives are really struggling. And it's not only about economic power as well, it's also about political power. Debates about data privacy, for instance, or data security, which were taking place with escalating intensity before the pandemic began, I think, if we're honest, really fell away during the pandemic. Sort of do whatever it takes mentality took hold, and we gave around the world technology companies a huge amount of power to collect data on our movement, on our spending habits, from our credit card histories, from CCTV, sift it, sort it, mine it, analyze it in a way that just would have been unimaginable 12 months ago. And so I think we do face a challenge now of what we do about this extraordinary political power that we've given lots of these companies. And then there's the challenge of meaning and purpose. And I found this quite an interesting feature of a lot of the popular commentary during the pandemic. It's quite unfamiliar. A lot of it's been focused on, well, how ought we to spend our time in the sort of enforced idleness that we found ourselves in under lockdown. I think many of us know what gainful employment looks like. I don't think lots of us know what gainful unemployment looks like. And I think that's come through in some of the challenges that people have faced with what to do with themselves over the last few months. So there's a sense in which the pandemic has given us a glimpse of the future that I'm writing about in the book. But I also think that the pandemic may have, and there's a huge amount of uncertainty about this, but I think it may have increased the threat of automation. It may have meant that we have to take more seriously rather than less seriously the sorts of technological challenges that I just described. And let me give you just a few reasons why I think this is so, and this will be useful for our broader conversation. The first is that inevitably accompanying a pandemic, in many parts of the world, we found ourselves in recession. And some of the evidence suggests that when economies turn down, automation can actually pick up. So one example from the United States, the most distinctive feature of the US labor market over the last few decades has been the hollowing out of the labor market. The technological change has largely displaced middling skilled workers in the middle of the labor market. And when you look, though, at when in time those middling skilled jobs were lost to technological change, one recent study suggested that 88% of those job losses took place within 1 year of a recession. So I think that's one reason to take the threat of automation more seriously now rather than less. A second reason is to do with incentives, that this pandemic has created an entirely novel, unfamiliar incentive to replace people with machines. A machine cannot catch the virus. It's not going to have to isolate to protect co-workers or customers. It's not going to have to take time off work to recover. And I worry about what this new incentive might mean for decisions to replace people with machines, particularly when all the remarkable measures we've seen around the world that governments have adopted to try and get employers to keep their employees on their books, like the furlough scheme here, once those sorts of measures are wound down. I think a third reason to take it more seriously rather than less seriously is a realization that many people have had during the pandemic that many people's jobs, while some people have been able to work remotely, and in particular white-collar workers, many blue-collar workers have found that actually their jobs are incredibly tightly linked to particular places, whether it's a receptionist in an office or a barista in a coffee shop or a retail assistant on a high street. All their jobs rely upon physical places and those places flourishing from an economic point of view. And I worry as well about what happens as we emerge from the pandemic if people don't return. I think the death of the office, the death of the high street, the end of the city and so on, those things are probably overstated, but I do worry about, what happens if we don't return, if those places don't recover or take time to recover to their previous thriving selves? What does this mean for all these workers whose jobs rely very heavily upon particular places? I think I just want to finish with one final thought, which is about a cultural shift that might have taken place over the last few months as well. Out of necessity, we have been forced to do things with technology that just would have seemed unimaginable 8 to 12 months ago. Overnight, online education, virtual courts, telemedicine, all these things just became the norm. And I think it's become quite, and what's interesting, of course, is that many of the technologies, such as the one we're using today, many of these technologies have been around for years. They're not particularly radical, they're not particularly revolutionary, but out of necessity, we've been forced to adopt them. And I wonder, and again, it's speculative, but I do wonder how our attitudes to technology might have changed during the pandemic. Yes, there's been spectacular failures in the use of technology, but there's also been some surprising successes. And it seems to me that in months to come, once we emerge from the pandemic, activation will seem far less radical than it might have seemed 8 to 12 months ago, before the sort of grand technological experiment we've all been involved in over the last few months got underway. So I will finish there. Thank you very much for the chance to share some thoughts, and I look forward now to hearing some comments and in turn taking some questions too. Thank you very much.
That was brilliant, Daniel. Thank you. So we're now going to turn to Elisabeth Reynolds with the perspective from MIT and her very early morning there. Thank you, Professor Reynolds.
Thank you both, and thank you, Daniel. Those are excellent comments, and particularly the focus, I think, on COVID is essential, because there is sort of a way in which we have to look at things at pre and post-COVID, no question about it. There's been dramatic changes. I want to say that I've loved your book. World Without Work is something everybody should read. It brings a historical perspective to a lot of the current debates, which I think is really important. It's accessible. It's also, I think, driving forward as well to what do we need to do? What's the possibility in terms of responses and actions? And so I think that's important. I also think that as you sort of outline in the book, we are in a tremendous, we should not underestimate sort of the tremendous changes going on technologically. We've got, accelerating investments in AI and robotics. It's as you say, kind of mind-blowing, I think, from what we've seen in the past. I also think one of the things that you highlight that is important to recognize is that a lot of this technology, technology should be seen as a tool. It's a tool that we invent and a tool that we use, but that tool has, in most cases, or in many cases, it's substituting for lower skilled work, for those who have more routine jobs. It's complementing for higher skilled work. So it sort of helps, it accelerates that bifurcation you talked about before, that kind of hollowing out. And so technology is not this neutral, factor. It's something that plays out in many different ways and affects people differently, and we need to respond for that reason. I think there are two things that I would comment about in terms of the world without work as you put it out there, and then I'll say a few things about COVID. As you say, this is sort of a long-term view. You're not talking about an overnight piece, and I'd say that if history is anything for us to look back toward, then the elimination of work altogether, the lack of jobs for people, I think is not necessarily the challenge we are facing going forward. We've had automation for decades now. Obviously, AI is adding a whole new element to it, but we can't forget that with the elimination of jobs comes the creation of jobs. And we have, in recent research at MIT, identified about over 60% of the jobs we have today weren't around in 1940, right? We are actually creating new jobs, creating new industries over time. And that part is hard for us to see. It's, we can only see behind us and what we've lost, but we need to remember that that's actually also happening, and that is part of responding. It doesn't mean, as you point out, it doesn't mean that in fact, a lot of workers are at risk, they're at economic risk. And our real challenge is the quality of jobs going forward. As you outline really well in your book, there's a way in which not just the hollowing out, but the sort of impoverishment of a lot of the jobs and low wage work that's led to increasing income inequality. The other point I would also just want to highlight for everyone is how automation, just because we can automate something doesn't mean that we do automate things. It's really hard, the implementation of some of this. We talk about the AV, the driverless car. That has been something that people have been predicting would, happen essentially today or in the last couple of years. We're decades away. We're decades away, at least in the next decade, to something that has, is probably not have a driver, but is on some sort of, mini bus, citywide, kind of route of some kind. We've talked about the robotic gripper that's going to pick and pack for us every day, for these warehouses. The fact is that's been a really hard technology for people to do. Amazon currently, as you say, big tech, shamelessly benefiting from a lot of this crisis, is hiring 2,800 people a day right now. So there's a lot of ways in which I think we see a slow adoption and challenges to adoption of new technology. Walmart has decided they're going to take away the robots for the inventory, that people work, a little bit better. And we see a lot of what matters now, and you made this point too, that the IT, the internet, the sort of technology that was invested in 30, 40 years ago is really the part that we're seeing a real impact on jobs now. So I think we're at an early stage with AI and robotics. It's, a 30 or 40 year cycle. We do have time to adjust and address some of the issues, which again, you address in your book. And I think from my point of view, that's where our energy needs to be focused is, it's not necessarily, we won't have enough work, but we're going to have this low quality work. And the US is the worst of anybody in terms of looking at the, low quality work and how it doesn't pay relative to other countries. Other countries have, weathered this technology and globalization better certainly than the US. And I think it provides opportunities for us going forward. In terms of coronavirus, which I agree with you, some of the impact is already evident. And what it's done is essentially expose the weaknesses of a system that is, relatively stronger or weaker across countries. You can look at the response to coronavirus and see whose economic system, if you will, or political economy system is better in a position to better protect workers versus not. The US is certainly not. We had a massive response by government to try and keep people afloat. And those days we're in a very difficult time right now if the federal government doesn't step in again. But no doubt, those who are most affected are those who are at the lower end of the service economy, those who are not servicing business travelers or commuters anymore. A lot of those jobs, as you say, are gone forever, but I suspect some percentage of them will come back. The point is, how do we support those workers not only through this time, but in a broader way going forward in this time of challenge. I would say that creating opportunities for those who have been most affected, not only by Corona, but by the income inequality is our biggest challenge. I actually think technology is going to be, right now, all of the new things coming in, it's largely complementary to people. It's not, I think that the risk of complete replacement of a lot of white collar work is probably overstated. But there is no question that we have automation has now got an opportunity with COVID to take a hold and probably have a greater impact than we could have imagined. So I think there's a sort of short-term issue about how we're going to get out of this crisis. How do we deal with the recession that we will be in? But technology is going to be part of the answer for that too, as we saw with the COVID vaccine, and in many other ways. I think it's going to be something that helps us. The other point I wanted to raise was also a demographic point, that long-term, we see this issue of aging workforce, declining fertility rates. And so from, pre-COVID, we had these very tight labor markets. We were all, unsure kind of where we're going to find workers. I wonder what you think about, are we going to get back to that point? Obviously, it's not about, we'll have plenty of workers looking for jobs, but long-term, I think that's a factor for us to talk about as well. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Daniel. You were both brilliant. No surprise. Let me flag for everybody, for those of you who would like to submit questions, please do so via the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom windows. I see questions are already coming in, and they are very good ones. So we're going to leave most of our remaining time to taking your questions. But let me start with one. Daniel, you've worked at 10 Downing before, right?
Yes. Yeah. 2009, 10.
Right. And I'm struck by the very political moment that we are in right now. Exactly 12 years ago, I was on Barack Obama's presidential transition team amidst the cratering of our global financial system. And it seems to me we're in another one of those moments where, both based on COVID, but also based on the dynamics that you both have described, the way to address much of this, it seems to me, is through policy, and therefore through politics, and therefore through politicians. As disappointing as that may be, it could be worse. But let me ask you both, if there were a bilateral meeting between Boris Johnson and President-elect Joe Biden, and they asked the two of you to join them for a few minutes to give them advice, because Boris and Joe were both talking about the impact of automation, and neither really had their arms entirely wrapped around it and how it related to COVID. And my goodness, what do we do? And so they gave you each a couple minutes to give them some advice. Boris and Joe are sitting across from you. What advice do you give them about what to do? Daniel, let's start with you.
Yeah, and I suppose it's a really interesting question. And a third of my book is about what we ought to do, because this is, what do we do in response to these challenges? And it's also quite interesting. I mean, if you subscribe to my view, which is that COVID has, in a sense, given us a glimpse of what a world with less well-paid work might look like and the challenges that we face. We can also learn the lessons of what has and what has not worked well during the pandemic in responding to those challenges. But let me just focus on one of them, which is the economic challenge. I mean, it seems to me that what we need to do, and this ties in with Liz's comments as well, I see a challenge of a world with less work, a challenge of technological unemployment, very closely related to the challenge of inequality. And this is how I'd frame it. I don't think it's a coincidence that today worries about automation are intensifying at exactly the same time as worries about automation are growing. The two things are very closely related. Today, the labor market is the main way we share out prosperity in society. For most people, their job is their only source of income. Inequality is what happens when some people get vastly more than others in the labor market. It shows that approach is already creaking, and technological unemployment is just a more extreme version of that story, where some people don't get anything in return for their work at all. So my main proposal would be to focus on those either lower paid or lower skilled workers, and to take a far more generous attitude from the standpoint of the state towards supporting those workers. I write in the book about the need for a big state. It's not the big state of the 20th century that's command and controlling entire economic affairs from central government offices, but it's a big state not in production but in distribution that is far more generous and supportive towards those workers who are at that end of the labor market and struggling. So I don't think there's a need to treat it as a sort of distinct policy issue. I think it's very closely related to the challenge of inequality, and I think it necessitates a far more generous stance from the state, far more sort of fiscally generous towards those people who are in lower paid and more insecure work. So that's where I'd start, and all the sort of granular implications that would have for policy. But those are the people that I'd focus on, and that's what we've seen to some extent during the pandemic. It's kind of extraordinary to think. If you think about the economic debate that dominated European life over the last decade, how austere should we be? Just feels like it applies to a sort of parallel economic universe we no longer inhabit. That just isn't the constraint any longer. And we've seen the state take a far more generous approach towards less well-paid, less skilled workers in more insecure, less high-quality work. And to the extent that that's a legacy of our response, of the pandemic response, I think that's a great thing. But that's where my sort of policy efforts would be focused, on those particular workers and supporting them.
Thank you, Liz. You're sitting across from Boris and Joe, and they said, Liz, tell us what to do. What do you say to them?
I say, well, I just happen to have this new report that you should read. And that's a bit of a plug for the MIT Task Force new report called Work of the Future, Building Better Jobs in an Age of Artificial Intelligence. And in fact, if anybody had seen the cover of the New York Times yesterday, the Biden new Biden team that's coming in on his economic side is focusing exactly, I think, on some of what Daniel's saying, is focusing on how do we support lower wage workers. That is, as we recommend in our report as well, that means about raising the minimum wage. Right now in the US, the national minimum wage is at the same level in real terms as it was in the 1950s. So we just have ways to go. Worker voice has been has been decimated over time, whether that's in unions or traditional organizing groups or other groups. There's a role there. There's also a role, I think, for training and education. So I would be focusing on what they're calling now, again, coming out of the pandemic, people are focused on resilient occupations, resilient jobs, training for the trades, electricians, plumbers, looking in healthcare, nurses, and elsewhere. So this whole transition, there are people, the state, if you will, is responding. It's inadequate, but people are responding to try and help people shift gears and find different pathways forward with, with funding for new education. State of Michigan, anybody who was a frontline worker in April or May now has free education at community college for the next few years. That's sort of a modern GI Bill. So I think there's an education and training agenda. And then thirdly, I really think there's an innovation agenda here, and both the UK and the US are in a great position to be investing in the nascent technologies, in the long-term plays that are going to create the jobs and the industries going forward. If we look back at what the federal government, whether it was DARPA or other departments, have done for clean energy, have done for internet, all of that has kind of come to fruition today. And so in the US, again, public dollars for R&D, for investment in R&D have declined significantly over the last few decades. We need to boost that up to sort of be a complement to private sector dollars, which are important. They help commercialize things, but big tech, as Daniel has pointed out, isn't necessarily interested in society's biggest problems to solve, right? The public sector is. And so I think that the other agenda here is one that's not just about redistributing and supporting, but investing in the workers and investing in the future in terms of where we're going to see growth going forward.
Thank you for that, Liz. And I want to underscore one point you made, which is about some of the areas of the skilled trades, which are very well paying and which ought to be more esteemed, and which actually have enormous labor deficits. I mean, right now, the average age of a master plumber in the United States is in the low 60s. I believe 61 years old. The average age of a master electrician is, I think 58 or 59. And in fact, if you get a great plumber, you get a great electrician, you hold on to them for dear life. And one point that I would make alongside yours is that there's actually been a bit of a tyranny of the elites amidst all of this as well, where some of this, I believe, is a consequence of all of us smart people telling everybody that the only road toward well-being and the only road toward esteem in the workplace comes with a university degree. And part of what we've done in so doing is diminished and demeaned a lot of the work that we do associate with the skilled trades, which is dignified, important, and we've come to learn indispensable work. And this is a case where I would actually be critical of my own political camp. Barack Obama and Bill Clinton and others who have very inspiring stories, when their core message to the public is, we're going to make it easier for you to go to college, everybody needs to get a college degree, it does have a variety of different, highly negative byproducts that may have been unanticipated, but we now know they're there. So I really wanted to underscore that point by you, Liz. Thank you for making it. We've got loads of great questions, absolutely loads of great questions here. And so I want to keep going and push through some of these questions so we can give voice to these folks who are showing such real intellectual curiosity about both of your content. And we go to a question from Lee Rainey that I'd ask for you both to respond to briefly. And Lee writes, to Daniel's grand point that it could be difficult in the future for former workers to find meaning in life without work, are we heading into a future where deaths of despair become even more prevalent because people without work won't have an answer when they search for meaning in their lives? Let me ask you both to respond briefly to that. Go ahead, Daniel.
Sure. So I think the relationship between work and meaning is really very important. And although I did say that some say that work and meaning are inextricably linked, I mean, one of the things I'm trying to do in the book is investigate that relationship a little bit more closely. And I suppose there are two main findings that I write about. I mean, one is that for many, and both I think are relatively intuitive. I mean, one is for today, for many people, work is not a source of meaning and purpose. It's not particularly enjoyable. People, for large numbers of people, they don't get a sense of identity and purpose from their work. So that's just the first observation to make. I sometimes wonder if those people who write about work and meaning and confusing, their own satisfaction that they get from their particular job with perhaps the satisfaction that others get from their job as well. It's just not true, I think, that for everyone, a job is a source of meaning and purpose. The second is that when you take the historical view, the relationship between work and meaning has changed really quite dramatically. So, go back to classical times, for instance, and work is a sort of, prohibitively grubby affair. In Sparta, productive citizens are forbidden. Citizens are forbidden from productive work by law. Aristotle and Plato both thought work was a sort of prohibitively, as I said, grubby affair. These are, over time, the relationship between work and meaning has been very different. So part of what I'm trying to do is add a bit of context and a bit of insight into this relationship between work and meaning. And it is, I think, far murkier than commonly supposed. But there is, to the extent that work is an important source of meaning and purpose, or at least can be, then to various comments that Liz and I have both made, it is incumbent upon policymakers to not only focus on the quantity of jobs out there, which we so often do, what's the unemployment rate, what's the participation rate, and so on, but also the quality of those jobs. Not just how well paid is it, but how secure is it, how fulfilling is it, what sort of worker protections come with that work. All of those other things that affect whether or not a particular job is fulfilling or meaningful, other than the fact that it's just a job. And I think focusing on those features of work, focusing not only, as I said, on the quantity of work, but also the quality of work is an important thing to do, to the extent that there is a relationship for some between work and meaning.
I would agree specifically on this point about, aspirationally, we would like work to provide meaning for everyone. It certainly doesn't. There's a great quote in a recent paper by Josh Cohen, who is at Apple University, formerly at Stanford. Can we make jobs that are big enough for people? Can we create those jobs? Now, I don't have faith that firms will do that on their own. I think they need incentives or pressure. If we look at what Amazon has done under a lot of pressure, Amazon does not have a great reputation when it comes to automation or other aspects of it. They had raised their minimum wage for all workers to $15, which has had ripple effects across their warehousing areas, et cetera. They're now providing training for warehouse workers on site during work hours, not to necessarily rise in the ranks of Amazon, but to find jobs, meaningful jobs, career paths. I think what we want is opportunity. People in dead-end jobs, which is a lot of what service jobs are, why they're plentiful and why they don't pay well, is there's no pathway forward. So how do we create the pathway forward? To the point of deaths of despair, I hope the audience knows what that's specifically referring to, right? Which is particular research in the US around the devastating impact on working age males, particularly in manufacturing, who lost jobs over the last couple decades due to globalization, due to some technology as well, and where they could not find in their neighborhood more work, or if they found work, it was they took a significant cut in pay. And we've had there is some relationship to the opioids addiction and all of the suicide rates that have gone up. It's a crisis that we did not address when it happened, when we had deindustrialization in the States and Britain as well. We've seen the jobs move offshore, and a whole generation has been affected, and it's intergenerational as well. So I think there's absolutely kind of an urgency about responding to that, making sure that we have sort of pathways out or supports in place that really prevent that kind of path, that sort of reaction happening again. And we had globalization without guardrails in the States. So I think we need more guardrails for a whole host of reasons going forward.
Thank you. Daniel, in your remarks earlier, you brought up a friend of mine who ran for president, Andrew Yang. And I remember a year before the presidential election started, we were hanging out and he's like, I'm going to run for president. It's just like, shut up, Andrew. Yeah, okay. He's like, no, I'm serious. I'm going to run for president. Everybody's going to know what the UBI is. And I'm like, oh boy, calm down. And then lo and behold, he runs for president, and goodness gracious, he practically boils the ocean. I've got 3 kids, and I think he would have won 2 of their votes. And we got a really good question here from John Newham. And, it touches on the universal basic income. And he says, is a universal basic income more likely as a result of technological change, or I would add to that, some of what's happened with COVID? Could the furlough scheme introduced in 2020 be a possible template? I'd ask both of you for your short takes on that.
Yeah, I mean, I write a little about the basic income in the book. I find and I'm slightly objectionable towards it, not because of the B and the I, although I think it's ambiguous what we mean by basic, and I don't think it necessarily has to be an income, but it's more the universality that worries me, and I won't go into that, but I do write about it. The point I want to make, though, is that when the book came out in January, there were certainly a lot of critics who focused on the idea of a basic income, said, commenting on its infeasibility, its unaffordability, and there'd never be any sort of political consensus around an idea like that. And yet, what was so interesting in the pandemic was that after a couple of months, or even a couple of weeks, the idea of a basic income became completely commonplace in all corners of political conversation as a sort of possible response to the challenge of, well, how do we share our income when we can't rely upon the world of work to do it? And the point I want to make is just that there is, I think, a sort of malleability at the moment, quite unlike what many policymakers have experienced in recent decades, that that we are able to conceive of and get support for reforms, proposals that would have been quite unimaginable 8 to 12 months ago. So to that extent, I think not only the basic income, but more generally, I think the sort of policy space, the set of feasible interventions has got far larger as a consequence of the pandemic.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, we in the US, unemployment insurance did not cover gig workers and independent contractors, and there's a whole host of people in the labor market who would not have received unemployment insurance. So this has helped us see a path forward for stronger institutions to support workers. When it comes to UBI, I think the evidence shows that they do provide more can provide economic security. It does not necessarily help people find a job. It doesn't necessarily help people improve their job prospects or move up a ladder. And I personally would rather see investments that would help do that, would be around both supporting people's well-being, whether that's healthcare, childcare, transportation subsidies, all of those things, investments in training, and make those investments there. I don't think that we can reasonably imagine a long-term response based on some of the payments that we've made from government. It's just unrealistic. It's extraordinarily expensive. But I think that certainly coming out of this pandemic, we're going to need more support for workers. And I would like to see long-term, I'd like to see the institutions be the place we invest the dollars rather than in a UBI.
Thank you, Dr. Reynolds. It's absolutely overwhelming, by the way. More than 200 of you are tuning in right now. We've got dozens of excellent questions here. So we're just going to keep punching through your questions here until the top of the hour. But thank you all for your engagement here. It's really tremendous. The next question is from Robin Carpenter, who asks, what are the areas of work that are least likely to be impacted by advances in artificial intelligence and machine learning? Either or both of you.
I'll go first, Janet, just to mix it up for the audience here. So what's interesting, and again, Daniel speaks about this in the book, but counterintuitively, in the last decade or so, when we look at where demand is coming from in sort of job growth, it's a lot of places where social skills are highly emphasized, right? So the social skills, the interaction with people, as important as any of the technical or STEM related skills. And so any job that has that interaction, robots really have not been able to imitate, human interaction to any great extent. They can pretend that they're your pet, but after a while you're going to recognize it's not your pet. So we see growth in middle skill jobs. So nurses, social workers, teachers, anything that's interacting, I think, with people on some level, all sorts of customer service where, again, technology is enhancing it, but not replacing necessarily the customer service. And then, of course, the growth is for anybody who's using this technology to provide insight. It's a huge asset and a huge place where there's growth. So that is a lot in the higher professional services occupations. Daniel can talk about that to a greater extent. But there are definitely, and right now, if we look at through COVID and going forward, construction, manufacturing, the trades, as you mentioned, all have been quite resilient, and I think will continue to be, places where technology will be an enhancer, but not necessarily a replacer of jobs.
Yeah, I agree with those comments. It's absolutely right. Just one additional observation to make is that I suppose one of the sort of cruel ironies of the pandemic has been that many of those jobs that Liz mentioned that were protected from automation because they involve some kind of interpersonal interaction have been hardest hit during the pandemic precisely because of that personal interaction. That is how the virus spreads. Similarly, lots of the jobs that involve manual dexterity, which we found hard to automate, are precisely the jobs that have been hardest hit because they require groups of people to gather in poorly ventilated indoor spaces, factory floor, meatpacking warehouse, wherever it may be. And they've been hardest hit by the virus. And so I suppose one of my worries is that if you had asked me 12 months ago, where do you expect to see job growth in the future, which is sort of protected from automation and technological change, I would have appealed to some of the roles that Liz just set out, those that involve interpersonal interaction or those that involve some kind of manual dexterity. But because of what's happened during the pandemic and because of this uncertainty, I think, about what demand might look like for some of those service roles and for some of those more manual activities, I worry about whether or not demand for those roles is going to be robust enough to provide as much work for people as I was perhaps hoping it would 12 months ago.
Interesting, thank you. Let's talk about the developing world for a moment. Our conversation has tilted a little bit more towards sort of UK, US, Western, and developed. But we got a really good question from Randolph Kent, who says, my question is the extent to which these perspectives apply to poorer countries and societies where poverty is all too evident. I'll flag that we only have 10 minutes left, and any of the three of us could give long speeches just on this topic. But if you could spend just a minute or two, each of you, talking about how this relates to the developing and poor countries and economies.
Liz, do you want to kick off again, just to keep the order?
Sure.
Well, I'm happy to as well.
That's fine. There's no question that there's I think greater risk in developing countries for a lot of this technology for automation. The one thing that is true is that, again, implementation of a lot of this technology is very uneven, right? And it's we find some things in the across the developed world that are haven't hit different parts of the U.S. where they've hit other places. So I think it's a question. I think there's a long time lag. I think also we're dealing with lower cost labor, and so sometimes the cost of in bringing in technology into some of these economies is not the trade-off is not necessarily seen by companies as being worth it. So I think there's no question that there's a lot of risk, but there's also the possibility that some of this technology could be leapfrogging in a lot of these countries, that if you can bring in some of the technology, you can increase productivity and productivity of workers. And that, of course, is going to require concerted effort and focus and investment by by countries, but also by people thinking about supply chains and whether we can, work with supply chains that are actually going to be investing in workers. But I think that the bottom line is that for a lot of the developing world is low-skilled workers, where a lot of this routine work could be replaced by automation, and that's got much more serious, I think, consequences than we've seen in the developed world.
I'll add on top of that, more optimistic, a sort of additional way of looking at it, which is, I mean, I very much agree with, from the standpoint of workers, there are, these issues in the developing world are, I think, quite challenging. But from one of the things we do in conversations about technological change is that we focus a lot on what it means for workers, the future of work, what it means for producers. And we don't spend as much time thinking about what it might mean for consumers, recipients of work. And this is one of the arguments of a different book that I wrote, The Future of the Professions, which was looking at the impact of technology in law, medicine, accountancy, and so on, is that while it's quite challenging for those who might be working in those professions, it's very exciting potentially for those who are engaged with those professions. The promise of more affordable access to good education, good healthcare system, or good medical insights, advice on legal affairs, advice on how to manage your financial affairs. I mean, those traditional professions in many parts of the world, and particularly in the developing world, are creaking. Not enough people have access to all that sort of expertise. And so the promise of some of these technologies, while they're quite challenging for workers, is quite exciting for recipients. The promise of a sort of liberation of expertise that might have just been available only to a privileged and a very lucky few through face-to-face interaction, perhaps with a traditional professional. So I think there are, when we move away from just thinking about work and producers towards thinking about recipients and consumers, some more optimistic tones to be struck, and particularly in the developing world.
Vicky Price has invoked gender in her question. She's noted the IMF World Bank data that shows that women are disproportionately affected by AI and the general introduction of technology, and is wondering if either of you think there should be special measures for women. Is there anything gender specific that should be done as a response to all of this?
Yeah, I mean, I write about gender in the book in the context of what I call identity mismatch. One of my worries, at least for the next decade or so, isn't that there's not going to be enough work for people to do full stop, but it's that for various reasons people might not be able to do the work that's available. Sometimes because they don't have the right skills mismatch, and we've spoken about that. Sometimes because they don't live in the right place mismatch. Jobs are created in particular places, and if you don't live there, then you're going to struggle to take up that work. But I also think there's issues of identity and identity mismatch as well. So if we think of men of working age displaced from manufacturing roles in the United States by new technologies, there's some that say they'd rather not work at all than take up so-called pink collar work. Now, it's a really unfortunate term, but what it's designed to do is try and capture the fact that many of those jobs that we've been talking about, which are hardest to automate, are disproportionately, in fact, done by women. So things like preschool and kindergarten teaching, social work, nursing, more than 85%, I think, of those roles in the United States are done by women. And so I think there are some difficult issues as well of, and so there are, some say that these men would rather not work at all than take up those sorts of roles. And so I think in thinking about how we repair those mismatches and how we get people into the available work, we've not just got to think about skills and place, but also these issues of gender and identity as well. I think they're very important.
Yeah, I mean, if ever there was a time to recognize women in a crisis, it's COVID. Just Herculean efforts and, incredibly challenging, not only hit by the corona, both in positive and negative ways, right? Retail completely wiped out. Healthcare, education, social services, likely more demand in these areas, or certainly continuing in that space. I'd like to see policies that help women and that should be considered kind of, human decency policies. So call it, pay equity, childcare, paid family and sick leave. There's some basic policies that certainly we don't have in the States that we see elsewhere that would dramatically help everybody, but help women in particular. And I think that's, in my mind, hopefully part of the agenda going forward in the US.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm sad to say that we only have time for one question left. We've been flying through these things, and the time has been jumping on us. The question goes to the question of regulation, and the question is: to what extent should nations be regulating these technologies, if at all, while still being able to keep a national innovation edge? And, look, Daniel, I'm sure you heard it when you were in government. I certainly heard it during the 6 years that I was working for Barack Obama. As soon as anybody introduced the idea of regulating anything, there'd be a stampede coming in saying, well, if you regulate our American or our Western technologies, then all you're doing is allowing the unregulated or the very differently regulated non-Western, usually Chinese technology, to just fly by us. So this is really a race. This is a race for job creation. This is a race for wealth creation. This is a race for, making sure that our nations stay resilient in the face of all of this technological change. So what is the right degree of regulation or non-regulation where you can sort of harmonize it with the need to stay economically competitive and innovative?
I mean, I'd say that we need to focus not really on the extent of regulation, but the nature of the regulation. And I mean something quite particular by that. I said in my opening comments that I think the challenge with respect to large technology companies in the 21st century isn't so much their economic power, great and growing though it may be, and far more about their political power and issues like liberty and democracy and social justice, and whether those things are under threat. So take a company like Facebook. Yes, of course, some people are concerned about their economic dominance and the consequences of that, but far more people are concerned, it seems to me, about their political power. It said 2016 Russia was able to use the platform to influence the US election. That's an issue of politics. It's about the social scaffolding on which all of us live our lives. Now, why do I say this? Well, and it might sound like I'm shooting myself in the foot, but the debate about the regulation of big technology companies is really dominated by economists, and not only in the UK but around the world. And this is a problem because the tools that economists have to think about these issues, however wonderful and powerful and insightful they may be, for thinking about things like profitability and market concentration and excessive dominance and so on, are not particularly useful in thinking about those issues of liberty and democracy and whether they're under threat. So I think one of the most valuable things we could do is set up, similar sort of regulation infrastructure like antitrust policy or like competition policy here, but staffed not with economists and their traditional toolkits, but political scientists and moral philosophers and political philosophers and others who are capable of grappling with these, quite different issues of power that I think need to be addressed with these large companies.
I note the time here, Alec, but I'll just say, I think maybe in closing that, if we keep developing these technologies without changing our existing institutions, we can only expect to get the same outcomes we've had over the past decades. So we absolutely have to see a shift in institutions, and I think regulation is part of that plan going forward.
Well, Daniel Susskind and Elisabeth Reynolds, my sincere thanks to you both. Thank you to the Policy Institute of King's College for playing the role of convener. And look, one of my main takeaways from this is that those of us who are intellectually curious or intellectually engaged on this topic of the future of work, if you haven't read Daniel's book yet, you must. If today is an introduction to that thinking, then I imagine all of you will want to go deeper into it. There's also a link, if you look in the chat, pulling together Liz and her team at MIT's research. These are two of the best thinkers in the world on this topic, and I wish it were not the case. I wish it were not the case, but unfortunately, I think your work is only going to grow more relevant because I do believe that our world is accelerating in a way in which the things that you've been analyzing and forecasting are proving true. And the sooner that the Borises and Joes and much broader groups of stakeholders across government, from the nonprofit sector, from academia, can read and learn from your work, we will all be better off. So thank you all for attending, and thank you again to Professors Susskind and Reynolds.
Thank you so much.